Find something less federally funded right now, and it's like if I get a job, it might give me.
Honestly, good for you for going for like a policy.
Yeah, I would love
You'd be great at it. You'd be great at it. I know it is a unforgiving career path.
and applying for these feels like getting a scratch off lottery ticket and calling it an investment. Like there's so much.
Yeah, are you applying just like everywhere? Because I think it's a very different experience.
True. I'm learning.
I mean, I get that. If I didn't have a ton of family here, I would probably also do that.
Thanks for standing up as the former chair of the department. Now you're
To get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I think we have a really interesting program, and I'm glad you're not going to miss it. And welcome to the people who are Zooming in. My name's Denise Ward. I'm with the Friends of the Aptos Library, and you're here because of part of our Community Reads, which is a program now in its 8th year. And tonight's, well, all of our events are based on the book Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. How many of you have read the book just out of curiosity? Wow, okay. Some years it's just, you know, a couple hands. So yeah, we keep getting really good feedback on the book. So I also want to say thank you to Rowan because she's our tech person who keeps things rolling. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. Catherine Courtier. She has a bachelor's in marine biology from UC Santa Cruz and a master's in marine ecology and conservation from Scripps Institute of Oceanography. She's worked, I know everybody says that, Scripps. She's worked for California's Sea Grant, where she helped run their various fellowship and research grant programs. She's worked on projects related to aquaculture in California and non-native and invasive species in the Sacramento and San Joaquin Delta. That's just obviously a very little overview. You're going to learn a lot more about her work tonight. And Paige Kouba, she completed her PhD at UC Davis. She studied how climate and fire shape California's forests. Her research shows that prescribed and natural fire can restore Jeffrey pine forests in the Eastern Sierra. While teaching undergraduate ecology courses and leading grad students on orientation trips, she developed a lot of questions about building transformative learning communities. And now as a biology postdoc, she's researching how peer and mentorship networks form in the field and in educational settings, and how positive community building can support marginalized students in the area of STEM. And our moderator tonight is Lauren Hanneman. And she has been a marine and environmental science educator in the Monterey Bay for 20 years. You don't look that
In Santa Cruz, you have to have a lot of jobs.
She's been an outdoor educator with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, the O'Neill Sea Odyssey Program, and the Watsonville Wetlands Watch. And she's currently an associate faculty at CSUMB and Cabrillo College in oceanography and environmental sciences. So welcome and take it over.
Okay, bear with me for a moment while I get my presentation up. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. It's nice to see so many excited people here. I'm really happy to be here. I didn't know about this until my neighbor Mary told me about this organization, and I'm really excited to be here. And to have read another cool Barbara Kingsolver book. I've read a lot of her stuff before, and this one missed my radar. So just a couple of points about me. My name is Catherine Courtier. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a PhD candidate in the graduate group in ecology at UC Davis, and I'm a research affiliate at NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center. So just by Santa Cruz's Marine Lab. And I work kind of at the nexus of marine ecology, applied economics, and marine policy. So a fancy way of saying I don't have like a title because I do a smattering of a lot of stuff. And I mainly focus kind of on socio-ecological systems. And I just have a disclaimer at the bottom that all opinions expressed here are my own and do not represent the views of my employers and the people that pay me. I don't think anybody here is going to say anything, but I wanted to cover all my bases.
And tell us about your dog.
Oh, how could I forget? This, for those of you that live near me, you know my dog Moose. He's a giant Muppet. He's a 90-pound Bernedoodle who couldn't be here because he had to watch his programs tonight. So this is kind of the title of my talk and a broad idea of what I work on right now. So kind of look at how commercial fisheries on the West Coast are responding to changing ocean conditions. With this kind of flow in mind of, I have kind of this idea of changing ocean conditions that I don't specialize in, but know enough to be dangerous. But what I really focus on is how this implements changes in marine ecology and then how this trickles down into changes in fisher welfare. I probably did a bad job of explaining some jargon. So I want, if people have questions, just raise your hand and tell me it doesn't make any sense, because I don't want, there's no point in presenting if nobody understands what I'm talking about. So I wanted to just kind of start this off.
It happened, the glitch happened. Yes. Put the screen
Okay.
there and start. Thank you.
Anybody have a word for resilience that comes to mind?
There you go.
Reading?
Perseverance.
Perseverance, I like that.
Grit.
Grits.
Oh, great.
I like grits.
You're going to be good.
Yes. Adaptable. Adaptable.
I like those.
Yeah. Anybody else can just fire it out. No.
Yes.
Nasties.
These are all my favorite words.
Yeah, I like these. These are good, like what you want to get when you open up a fortune cookie and it says you are this. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what does resilience mean in my work, both for ecological systems and socially for fishing communities. So I figured I'd put the good old Merriam-Webster definition. Defines resilience as an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And I would say we are all very resilient people, especially in these days. So I think an important thing to think about when I think about resilience is the resilience of what? There's really the definition changes kind of depending on where you are, what you're looking at, and even the time period that you're looking at. So I think of resilience as something that's constantly changing and not fixed in time. And here's just kind of some more ideas I have about resilience, you know, the ability to find a new balance, change behavior to adapt to new conditions, adjust to a new normal, and kind of withstand disturbances and recover from them. So the first part of my research that I'm going to talk about relates to looking at how salmon fishers change their spatial behavior over time in response to climate change. So specifically looking at the literal GPS points of where they fish and how that changes over time. So I had a fact, the climate is changing and this will affect fish and in turn fishers, which is my motivation for doing this research. And so I'm specifically interested in how this distribution of the fishery changes over time, looking at patterns, with the hope that I can look to see what it could be like in the future. And so why do we care? Well, I care because I just think it's cool and I like it, but that doesn't get funding. And you have to justify things. So information on fishing activity is really important for marine spatial planning and fisheries management, which are two very important things to these systems. So these might be a little heavy on the, I hope it's not boring, just like the facts, but I have a couple slides just giving a little background to the systems, and I think this will be helpful later with our panel discussion. So this is just some information on, you know, how is climate affecting fish species. It does similar things to unfished species, but I focus on fish species. So kind of looking at it from a really broad, simplified lens, for salmon, which is my focal species, they're anadromous. So they spend part of their life in the ocean and also part of their life on land in bodies of fresh and brackish water. So they get subjected to two places with really bad conditions. So inland on land, they experience changes with water temperature and the flow. So in years when we don't get a lot of rain, we have sad salmon. And even some years we do get a lot of rain, we also have sad salmon because the habitat isn't really built to sustain them. And then we have oceanographic variables that change. So sea surface temperature, nutrient flow, ocean acidification, which then affect ocean processes and species dynamics, and then trickle down to an individual species. So I can talk very broadly about many of these, but please don't ask me too many questions on species dynamics. So these are some of the things that I'm interested in because it motivates changes in fisher behavior. So we've seen broadly with changes in marine species distribution because of climate change, reductions in abundance. So I'm guessing one of you at least fishes for something recreationally or commercially, or knows somebody who does. Somebody want to raise their hand? Yeah, okay, more than one. So I'm sure people know that a lot of species that are commercially important, especially large fish, have really declined in abundance over time, and even size. We see range shifts, things aren't being caught now or they used to be, and we see changes in the time and location of when species are reproducing. So then a little more specifically in salmon, we're seeing them migrate from their inland waters where they rear and they're hatched to the ocean at smaller sizes earlier, and then we're seeing adults return earlier to reproduce, and that kind of results in reduced survival. Smaller salmon aren't as fit to take on the big bad challenges of the ocean and our inland waters. So we've also seen a general trend of northward movement in salmon, so they're trying to get to colder waters, interestingly, except for the Monterey Bay, where some salmon go south because the Monterey Bay has a cool, deep marine canyon that has tons of different oceanographic stuff that I don't know about that makes it desirable for salmon. And then even in their freshwater phase, so salmon have this amazing ability to know where they need to return to have their eggs laid, is exactly the same place that they themselves were laid as an egg. But people have been discovering instances of this straying behavior. So they're not exactly going back to those same places. And people think it's because they're realizing the habitat is unsuitable. So in addition to there being effects of climate change on fish species, there's effects of fisheries on fish species. And so this is something that we call fisheries-induced evolution. And it basically happens because of size selective fishing. And this is mostly applicable to things like salmon, tuna, like large fish. And it basically means that you're catching the largest fish out there. And so when you do that, you're left with a bunch of smaller fish. They mature earlier and you end up getting larger populations of smaller and shorter-lived individuals. So this is our little fish Valentine's diagram. So you see two big fish have lots of baby fish and lots of eggs, and smaller fish have fewer babies and fewer eggs. So you can kind of imagine as you go through time, you go from really big individuals that have, we call them fecund, they have a lot of reproductive potential, to the smaller individuals that have less and less and less. And so this, again, relates to the resilience of the species. We see declining trends in the distribution and diversity of where they are, reduced number of young entering the population each year. And this undermines the strategy of like bet hedging, which you can kind of think of as opposite of putting all your eggs in one basket. So ecology likes diversity in terms of species, methods of survival, locations, so you can be resilient when big things happen. So if we had a huge hurricane, say, that hit Santa Cruz, we did get that warning, it might wipe out a population there, but if you go north, there's another one there. So you want to diversify your assets. Oh, wow, 10 minutes, oof, okay.
And 24/7.
Oh, all right. Oh, I'm gonna speed go through some of these. Okay, so this is important because there's going to be huge declines in fisheries on the West Coast, and this is not felt evenly among fisheries or states. And so it's really important to see where we're seeing these changes and which areas are being impacted the most, especially for something like salmon, which has a really complicated management. It's managed internationally, nationally, and then within the state. So it's gonna. So yeah, so this, I said before, it's really important for spatial planning. So all of these colorful dots on the left are all these areas of management. So whether that's marine protected areas, aquaculture areas, proposed wind lease farms, there's a lot of activity going on. And then this is an example of a fishing footprint for the salmon fleet for 2018 for the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. As you can see, there's a lot of intersection of activity and commerce and where people are fishing. And that's a concern because you can't fish in a lot of these places. And a lot of times when we have these activities that are proposed, like wind farms, they don't necessarily always consider how that can impact fishers. And so you go from having a management area to having an idea of where someone is fishing. But what's even more helpful is having an idea of where the intensity of the fishing is. So you can do these analyses, not only to see broadly where you're going, but where the areas that are being hit the hardest, which can really help with climate change because science to update management strategies is expensive and slow. And so having an idea of how things are changing over time can help managers more effectively say, well, we used to think that salmon were getting hit hard really here. So we had, you know, better management strategies to take care of the populations there, but now it's actually shifted north. This is, I think we're just gonna skip through this. This is just a fun graphic that I made of showing how the fishing footprint of salmon fishers has really changed over time. Salmon fishing trips have gotten longer, both in terms of like distance traveled and days. And there's many reasons this could be happening. But I think it's a result of a longer search time for fish, meaning that people who have been fishing salmon for a long time are going to the places they've historically caught it and not finding them there. So they have to spend more and more time going to new areas to find fish, which results in higher costs. So that's the first half. Okay, made it through.
Okay.
So that first project is looking at a salmon fishery which spans California, Oregon, and Washington. This second project is looking specifically at the red sea urchin fishery in California, with kind of the idea of there was a really great red sea urchin fishery in California. It basically crashed. There's lots of efforts to restore kelp and kelp forest ecosystems. The question is, if we restore kelp, is there still going to be a red sea urchin fishery there to fish the species, or have fishers had to leave to find different employment because the fishery crashed? So kind of very similar motivating questions to my salmon project. And something that I think will be interested of people here is kind of talking about the ecological consequences of kelp loss and sea urchin barrens. And I think probably most people here know a little bit about this because we're so close to Monterey and have such amazing resources there. But on the left, we have this beautiful kelp forest system that's healthy. It has things like abalone, which we can never find anymore, and just really healthy kelp. And then on the right, we have this urchin-dominated barren, which is devoid of a lot of life and kind of just looks like the sad purple rock. And so I'm interested in finding out how are red sea urchin fishers fitting into this question. And I guess to give a little background, I think I have it. Oh, cool. Okay. So there's lots of causes of kelp forest decline in California and also Oregon and Washington, but this focuses on California. They say there was like a perfect storm of events that happened, I think around 2015. So there were incredible marine heat waves. So just imagine when it gets to like 87 in Santa Cruz and everybody's freaking out, but have that in the ocean. So marine organisms get stressed just like humans do. They have a narrow range of temperatures that they feel comfortable in. And once you get too far on either side of that, they freak out. It stresses their bodies out. They're more susceptible to diseases, predation, and death. So that happened. There was a local extinction of a red sea urchin predator, which sea stars. So we have just like the bat stars that like to hang out on pier pilings and you see in tide pools. And then also these really cool things that are sunflower stars that can have up to, I think I read recently, like 50 arms, and are pretty cool looking. So there was this thing called sea star wasting disease, which essentially was a disease that made them turn to mush. So those are two things that knocked them out. And then, so there's two types of sea urchins that we have in California. We have purple sea urchins and red sea urchins, and there's only a fishery for red sea urchins. So they were already getting hit by the commercial fisheries. The purple ones aren't as desirable. And so that just gave the purple ones a chance to kind of outcompete the red sea urchins. So you can see this is a sad graph of it's the catch of sea urchins, which I'm going to use as like a proxy for the number of sea urchins out there, which for the purpose of this is okay. But you can see that purple sea urchins really took off around the time of the marine heat wave and the sea star wasting, and the red ones have just been kind of struggling. And so we've seen for 10 years this kind of maintenance of urchin barrens, and this is maintained for a lot of reasons, but storm damage is one of them. Kind of rips out kelp that's trying to recruit to the area and grow. The water's been really warm. I know it doesn't ever feel like it because the water's super cold, but it is warmer than it should be. And then over harvesting of sea urchin predators. So unfortunately, the things that protect our kelp forests are also the things that we find the tastiest and that we want to eat. So with all of this said, there's different ways you can adapt and build resilience into a system. There's ecological adaptation. So you can think of alternative futures to a kelp forest. So we can do things like reintroduce urchin predators. So like the sunflower stars I talked about. You can do riskier interventions, which include like assisted migration. So you can try to actually take the kelp and move it into a new place, which high cost, high reward. You can do continual restoration, which is what a lot of organizations are doing right now, like the Nature Conservancy and California Sea Grant have been investing heavily in kelp forest reforestation, so like outplanting kelp little babies. Or you can say, this was a great system, but it's never happening again. We still want the species that are found in it, so we're going to just increase aquaculture and try to grow the species that we need. And so I'm interested in how these alternative ecological features can translate into alternative social futures for people that depend on this system. Okay. So my project goal is similar: assess changes in spatial and temporal extent of red sea urchin fishing. Different than salmon, sea urchins really don't go anywhere. Salmon fish, they swim, they migrate huge distances. Sea urchins can move, but very slowly and over very small spaces. But they still do move at a slower pace over time. So I'm interested to see if I'll see any kind of signal of movement. So interested in how space use changes over time, and also what sea urchin divers did when the fishery crashed. There's a bunch of ways that you can adapt to this. So kind of think about adapting to climate risk for fishers. Two different ways you can adapt in place. And these are things like you move to a different fishery. So for red sea urchin fishermen, that means moving to catching sea cucumbers. So move to a fishery that has similar gear requirements, so you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of new stuff. You could exit fishing altogether and pursue a different career, maybe open up like a bookstore or coffee shop. And then you have things that are adapt on the move. So you could follow, you're not going to follow the sea urchin, but for example, with the salmon, you could follow the salmon, which has its own costs. You then have longer to go back home if you're going to do that, or you have to move your whole industry somewhere else. So they both have their benefits and their drawbacks. All right. There's baby moose. And if anybody has questions, you could probably do maybe like.
Could you explain the connection of the kelp and the urchin? Does the urchin eat the kelp?
Yeah, they do. They love it. They like crunch,
So
crunch,
now
crunch.
Urchins are eating kelp.
Yeah. So the kelp really got knocked back with that big marine heat wave. And so as it was trying to regrow, that coupled with there being way more purple sea urchins, than there had been historically because we lost a lot of their predators. So they were overeating, they were eating the kelp faster than it could grow. And an interesting thing about sea urchins is that they can subsist off of nothing. So they're literally in barrens eating rock. They call them zombie urchins. So they can still survive even if there's no kelp to eat. So it's really hard to get rid of them. Oh, yes. The question was what the connection was between the kelp and the sea urchins, and if it was that the urchins were eating the kelp, which is a great question because I did not make that clear. So thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned the fish for the larger fish. I believe on the East Coast with the striped bass, they have an upper side that you can't eat, and lower side. Has that been thought about for salmon also?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the question was on the East Coast for striped bass, they have size limits. So over a certain size, you can't catch them, and under a certain size, you can't catch them. So that usually tries to target the most vulnerable stage. So when they're young, and then when they're most able to reproduce and have lots of baby fish. So they do that for salmon, but one of the problems was I think they did it too late. And that's not the biggest thing for salmon. The biggest issue for salmon is what we've done to their habitat inland. So things like dams, that's really messed up. And we'll talk about that a little later, but that's really impeded the number of baby salmon that successfully hatch and are reared in fresh waters that then migrate into the ocean.
We're gonna do a whole Q&A, so I'm just gonna ask, and your questions are going to be awesome. I don't know if you need to write them down and take a moment to the phone and voice memo it. I usually to do that. But I want to give time to have Paige present, and then the idea is then we'll start kind of a panel discussion, and then the rest of the time will be questions addressed to both, to individually. So hold those questions.
Thank you, everyone.
We have crossed paths in our careers thus far. We both went to UC Davis, so I'll tell you a bit more about my journeys. I think the photo you introduced yourself with was from the Odyssey.
Sure was. And you were my TA.
Orientation trip. We go way back.
Origin.
All right, I will take over
Okay.
the laptop spot, and we'll do a little do-si-do. And I have, I am wild for slide transitions, so I will apologize in advance. Okay. I got so excited by the book that we read and the science that I can see it connecting with, and the work that I've been able to do, and especially the work of my colleagues who study terrestrial ecosystems. But before I get to all that, I just want to thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to be a part of our community reads. I think this is such a wonderful suite of events and takes a ton of effort to organize, I know. So really thrilled to be here today. That's me in my forest. My name's Paige Kouba. I use she, her pronouns. And I'll give you a little bit of info about me before we get into things. As Denise mentioned, I finished my PhD at UC Davis in September, so newly minted. Thank you. Thank you. That never gets old, so. But I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. I made my way to the East Coast for undergrad, came back west for grad school at Davis, and then found my way here for a postdoc at UC Santa Cruz, studying education. I can explain. But before I get there, I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm from. Eugene, Oregon. If anyone been to visit there, lovely place. Happy to hear that. A lot in common with Santa Cruz, I would say, culturally. It's a green place. It's crunchy. It's vibrant. It's beautiful, and it has an interesting history when it comes to forests. I think I was always destined to study trees because my high school mascot, we were literally the Axemen. So there's this tension there in Eugene with all the nature-loving people, including ones who raised me, living and breathing the trees, and then the history of the logging town that it is, and sort of the dualism of that, I think, is really boiled down in our relationship to the spotted owl, for example. When I was in grade school, my older sister founded the Save a Spotted Owl Club in my first ever exposure to conservation efforts, and we all put our pocket change in a big plastic bear. I don't know if we saved any spotted owls, but I noticed when I saw the bumper sticker saying, "I love spotted owls, fried," that there was some different opinions on that, as we've seen in our reading. So I'll zoom out for a second and say that while I was always destined to love trees, the ecosystems that they inhabit and the ecosystems that they indeed themselves are shaping have been changing under our noses the whole time I've been learning about them. You maybe have seen this before. My guy, Dave Keeling, who did a lot of good work to make this graph of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. When I joined the Axemen in 2009, when I started high school, our atmospheric CO2 levels were 387 parts per million. In the book, you might remember that they find some representatives of the organization 350.org. Ask Me About 350 was written all over my high school hallways. But by the time I was born, we'd surpassed 350 parts per million in the atmosphere, and had far departed from pre-industrial levels that were about 280. I asked my students sometime what level of CO2 in the atmosphere they think we're at, and they check their phones like it's on the weather app, like it changes day to day. And so I realized that I need to do my part in explaining how this works. It does rotate seasonally, it fluctuates as the climate breathes in and out, but it's steadily increasing. By the time I graduated college, we were at 404 parts per million, and today we sit here just over 424. So that's happening. It's a worse feeling than being behind on your slide prep, but similarly dreadful. I also want to explain that if you zoom out, as I learned in my science classes, that entire graph I showed you in the slide before is collapsed into the very right side of this figure. You can see on the x-axis that going back almost 1 million years, we are seeing historic CO2 levels in the atmosphere at or below 300 parts per million. So just to give you a sense of that spectrum. And of course, as CO2 levels have increased with accelerating increase, the atmospheric temperature and surface temperature has increased even more rapidly to match. So seeing that the 94, when I joined this planet, to now, our average change in temperature in terms of degrees Fahrenheit per decade has skyrocketed. I didn't do that, just for the record. So that's a little bit about me and how I got interested in this stuff. By the time I got to college, I was learning about how trees don't just live in the world, they shape the world. And I thought that was the coolest thing. I wanted to learn about the carbon cycle and how trees take up CO2, fix it into their bodies as part of photosynthesis, and then emit oxygen that we love to breathe. In talking about the climate system, it's important to think about how we've changed it as humans. So you might have heard about carbon emissions and representative concentration pathways. So the Intergovernmental Climate Change Commission and the sort of pathways that they represent here are useful so that we can have projections for the future based on different scenarios. So we have in green, the very optimistic, all the way to in dark red, the kind of lights out, burn it all approach, which looks ever more popular these days. But you'll notice that there's no error around these lines. That's because these represent an input, and we know exactly what we want to feed into the models. By the time we translate this into the temperature change that results, you'll see a lot of error. So the lines are representing our best guess, and the shaded area is showing the error around that guess. There are folks out there who will tell you, climate scientists, they don't even know what's going to happen. There's uncertainty in their models, so we shouldn't listen to them. But I probably don't need to tell you that there's different types of uncertainty that just come as a part of science and living in the world. We have uncertainty around which of these pathways we'll even be on, which is up to all of us and our policymakers to help us decide. We have uncertainty about the statistical likelihood of different things happening. If you flip 1 trillion coins, some come up heads and some come up tails, and you can't know before it's happened. And finally, we have the complex processes that underlie parts of the climate system, like the ones that I study, which, because they're not as simple as flipping a coin, even many coins, We have emergent properties that change the way the inputs turn into outputs in the climate system. So we have to study the range of outcomes that all these different scenarios might give us. When I came to the field of biology, ecology, environmental science, I knew about these, so that there's trees. I knew they take in CO2. I knew they were doing photosynthesis. I knew they were taking in the climate warming gases. I knew that was a good thing. CO2 being a greenhouse gas, I probably don't need to tell you, is warming the climate. And so if trees can fix it, that they can save the day. Maybe. Trees take in CO2, but that's not the whole story. We're going to get a little bit more complex here, showing some of the things taking in carbon, like our trees in the green arrows, and then things emitting carbon in these sort of browny red arrows. We know, as residents of California, if you've been here more than a minute, that there's fires, there's deforestation in the tropics, there's global scale effects of decomposition in a natural setting, fire that's natural, fire that's outside the range of what would be considered natural, but all those things put carbon back into the atmosphere. And when I should mention that all these rather blurry numbers are in units of gigatons of carbon, so billions of tons of carbon molecules. We've also got other land plants, which I'm contractually obligated to say are also cool, even though they're not trees. So they're fixing more CO2. Changes from one land type to another can actually cause more output of CO2, as in the case of converting land to agriculture. And then there's this thing I've heard of called the ocean, but I won't spend any time on that. How did I end up working at Coastal Campus? So across these different sources and sinks, as they're called, we have one big missing one. You might have spotted it. It's us. We have this extra set of arrows. These are showing different decades worth of emissions and fixing and fluxes. But we are the biggest single arrow into the atmosphere that's not counterbalanced. We have this 9.5 gigaton flux to the atmosphere from human fossil fuel emissions, balanced by these steadfast and diligent green arrows, but they don't add up to make enough of a difference. They can slow the progress of climate change, but they're not stopping it. Another thing I have to warn my students against, and I want everyone to be on the lookout for, is people who will say, if there's 800 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, and we had a 4 or 5 gigatons, you know, what's the problem? The problem is A, it's 4 or 5 every year. B, it's not counterbalanced by anything, and that's leading to the rise we saw in the earlier graphic. So this slow creep that's no longer so slow is causing dramatic effects on ecosystem scales. Because of the complex feedbacks that I mentioned, where trees are taking in CO2, but also responding to different factors that change through climate change, such as water availability. My PhD work at Davis was to build what I call a climate change time machine and put little baby oak seedlings in these bubbles of future climate and study how they would respond to water stress at the CO2 levels we expect to see in the mid-21st century. Some days it felt like if I took long enough with this, I could just wait and find out for myself. But I did end up wrapping this project, taking in the samples, and you'll be among the first to hear because I'm still figuring out exactly what we found out. In short, the effect of water on seedlings is thought to be sort of substituted by CO2, that if you have water-stressed seedlings, you can sort of make up for that lack with carbon dioxide. But in our studies with actual empirical data, rather than making a computer simulation about it, we found sort of a surprising outcome, which was that only the seedlings that had abundant water were able to take advantage of the extra CO2 subsidy. And that means that you could see even bigger gaps in performance between water-rich and dry environments if this bears out. So again, this is not even published yet, but I will keep you all posted, assuming I am federally allowed to do that. All right, part 2 is that trees are not just shaping the climate. Every tree is part of a forest that's shaping the climate, but it's also a part of, it's an individual responding to that climate. And you may think that trees just stand there and kind of take it, but this tree has a lot more personality than that, and so do they all. Some trees respond to climate more successfully than others in terms of evolutionary fitness. Do they migrate? I really wanted to work this in because of the themes of the book, and so I asked a couple friends whether they think that trees migrate. Among the researchers I know working on this, we have some yeses and some nos. Dr. Kaiju is at University of Michigan. Failure to migrate, he's not coy. The finding here in Maine is that the trees are not successfully shifting their ranges to respond to climate. Unfortunately, some are. Here's an example of out of the hundreds and hundreds of tree species that they examined in this paper. Those red dots are showing seedlings and the blue dots are showing trees here in an actual map of forest inventory plots. And Dr. Zhu's colleagues found that the species of American holly was successfully at least growing seedlings farther north. So that's a snapshot in time. We'd have to wait and see how this bears out in the future, whether those are growing for a time and then dying before they reach the adult stage, or if they're indeed the first, guard of this northward march. On the other hand, we had species like the common persimmon and lots of others, unfortunately the majority, that either showed no northward expansion or indeed a range contraction from the north, which is called a bummer. It's an industry term. Over all the species they examined in this eastern US data set, only 20% of the species showed the potential for northern range expansion. So in a word, I would say this is because it's complicated. It may be cooler up north, but you might not have the soil type you need. You might not have the moisture profile. You might not have an animal species that you critically depend on. And so starting to mix and match those variables, as we found in our climate example with the butterflies, makes things difficult for our fragile ecosystems. Another person working on tree migration, this famously called Dr. Angelica Patterson, Angie Patterson, is called the shotgun scientist because she shoots down the boughs of trees. There's a reason, it's just easier than climbing. But she shoots down samples and she takes them back to her lab and she studies how they respond physiologically to the different temperatures that they inhabit and the different temperatures that she tests them at in an experimental setting. She uses that information to sort of inform the long-term data sets that they have at Black Rock Forest, showing that certain species are entering that part of the map and certain species are being lost. So you have it right there. Some tree species are moving their range, and why they're doing that is part of her research. And I just want to read, I think this is one of the cooler forest ecophysiology methods I know of. She uses a 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. And then she tells, she now works in science education like I want to do, bringing this news to the world and talking about the very cool things that trees can do. For our next contender, this is actually a lab mate of mine. Dr. Andrew Latimer was my advisor at Davis and is still a great friend and collaborator. Malcolm North, co-advisor and also great guy. I don't know Constance Miller, but I'm sure also a lovely person. But Dr. Brian Smithers led this paper that they called Leapfrog in Slow Motion. And this paper I especially like. It does show trees moving and trees shifting their range. It was the paper that I read that got me first interested in coming to Davis and joining this research group. To sum it up, at the high elevation ranges where, just like moving north to get to cooler temperatures, we can sometimes see species moving up in elevation. There was sort of a winner and loser in these two species, bristlecone pine, famously old gnarly dudes, and the limber pine, which also lives at high elevation with them. The limber pines, it turns out, partly due to their seed dispersal with Clark's nutcracker, where this individual is a young, probably 50-year-old baby, but a young limber pine that's establishing upslope from its bristlecone competitors, or neighbors at least. And the thought is that because of the animal dispersal aiding its move up the slope, these individuals are having more success at reaching that comfortable climate range. The sad truth is that they're all going to run out of mountain eventually. But in the meantime, we have limber pine having a little bit more of a toehold in this new climate space. So animals can help trees move in ways that serve the tree's needs. Kind of they're in cahoots in this case. On the other hand, a lot of animals, especially insects, will be getting to the trees and messing with them in herbivorous ways before the trees are able to reach those favorable climates. So in this case, we have the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a famous forest pest in New England. And it's marching north in these different recordings over the decades and really devastating the native hemlock populations there. This is a situation where in the darker brown ranges of this map, the hemlock woolly algid is completely eradicating hemlock forests, and it will change the character of the forest there. That's without a doubt. To study that, my friends at the Harvard Forest and I did a lot of inventories of every tree in a 500 by 700 meter plot. That takes a while, but we studied every tree and we studied every seedling in a subset of the plot. Here's Dr. Sydney Record and Brianna and Eliana working on those extremely meticulous surveys. We need that kind of data to be able to match real data with our experiments and our models, and to watch this climate change and changing species distributions happen in real time. Another example that I love, I show this to my students. This is the pine processionary moth, so called because they sort of hold hands, such as they are, and they form these long, they can be hundreds of caterpillars in a row, marching through the forest and like messing with people's dogs. Like they have these really bristly toxic hairs, and if your dog gets into a nest of these, your dog will have a bad time. They're not great for humans either, but usually people know not to eat these. In any case, they're a forest pest not just because of their nasty chemical effects, but they also can completely defoliate a forest, which I don't like. The larvae have a seasonal cycle in which they spend part of their time in the center circle of the photo. There's sort of cotton candy-like nest that they live in. And the warmth of that nest is one of the key determinants of their success. So the warmer they get, the more their life cycle can get sort of supercharged, and the further north they can march. In France and Europe, we see that as the temperatures have increased from the 1970s to 80s to the early 2000s, those lines showing the northernmost distribution of these moths observed are increasingly scooching north, is another technical term. This is because the moths found out that Paris is the city of light. I like that one. All right. I think I'm running out of time a bit, so while I would love to give more examples, all these changes have implications for the species we're studying, but we must not forget that we're one of the species in the mix. In the book, I thought the example of the Christmas tree farm was so interesting because it really brought home how we depend on forests. You know, not every one of us, not all of us in the same way, but all of us to some extent, and all of us are part of communities that we live in wood houses, we write on paper, we do things like that, at least for now. And the planting of the Christmas tree farm and the abandonment of the farm and the one generation hence wilderness that ensued was just a really good reminder that trees move on a different scale. Trees grow at the pace of family generations. And when we say that you put down roots somewhere, we mean that your family's planted. You know, we mean that you're stable and you could watch something like this happen on the landscape. Ironically, as climate change sort of continues to disturb our ecosystems, we're going to see more movement of human populations and less geographic stability. Next is to talk about specifically, right, this is Delarobia turnbow and the Christmas tree farm. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that in the news lately, in Middle Tennessee, we have actually got the flooding that was described in this book. I mean, if you needed to see it in the world, there it is. I think the passage in the end of the book when she realizes that she no longer recognizes her home is a feeling that many of us have experienced to one degree or another, whether it's the flooding in Tennessee right now, the fires in Southern California. We have a concept for this called solastalgia. This is a new term that was needed to describe the feeling of climate grief, or the feeling of missing the place that you're still in. When the place changes around you and when climate impacts affect you in a negative way, how do we handle that feeling? I really appreciated I'm not sure what word, the episode where Dr. Ovid Byron describes to the journalist how he really feels about all this. because in learning about this in graduate school for 6 years, I did not become more encouraged about our prospects. I became more determined to stay in the game to try and think about them. And there's a difference. I really appreciate and respect Kate Marvel, who's a NASA climate scientist. And she says that we need courage, not hope. I'm just going to read her words because she said it best. Grief is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness, and they're not worth less for it. But courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. That's what I try to model for my students. That's what I try to follow in my work. And that's what I try to do when I come to work every day. A thing that you can do that is courageous. I study forests. I have a lot of friends who work for the Forest Service. I have friends who are funded by federal programs like this, and cutting 10% of the Forest Service employees at this time in this state means having that much less workforce to do the brush management and the fuel management that we need to prevent a catastrophic wildfire season this summer. We don't control all the variables, but that staff and that labor is one of the things that we do have at our disposal, and it is borderline suicidal to not take advantage. So I'm gonna put this here. If you'd like to take a photo, please feel free. If you're able to, if you have the time and resources and the chutzpah to call your representatives and ask them to please stop this. Please bring those staffers back. Please restore our federal funding, and please restore our ability to do science and talk about it honestly. That would be awesome. So thank you for those of you who are able to do that. And thank you all for your time and for coming to this event this evening. It's been great to talk to you.
Shares. Right? Technology is not my thing. There's only one button, but it's very intimidating. So I want to make sure that there's enough time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to take some of the questions that we discussed and I'm going to merge them together, if that's all right with you. And I think one of the first things, so I want to talk about shifting baselines in a moment. But I kind of want to take the big picture and then let's kind of like narrow it down, right? And so I'm going to ask these questions to both of you individually. And I think I'm actually going to start with Paige because you just finished. And this was a question that came to my mind. So we know that the forests are changing. We know some are adapting more than others. We know that that's based on species. Can you go explain a little bit further about how, and even though the type of forest might change, how improving forest health can aid in carbon sequestration? One, and also if that is species dependent.
If carbon sequestration is species
Yes.
dependent. Yeah, great question. I always think of a meeting we had with some people who had money. I think they came from the transportation department or something, but they wanted to know if their forest health programs were successful. Are we supporting forest health? And we had to sit there and tell them, we can't answer that question. There's too many things that are wrapped up in that term. When you talk about carbon sequestration specifically, that's something that we can go on. Unfortunately, I think when we think about the carbon storage capacity of forests and the biodiversity that they support, those goals are not always in parallel. And so if we want to support the spotted owl, we need old, mature forests with a lot of different age classes of trees. If we wanted the most carbon per square foot, we would have kind of a monoculture or a plantation style. And so while you can align those goals to some extent, that the devil's in the details. And once you start to get to extremes and play those scenarios out, we find that not all of our environmental initiatives in terms of forests have the same look in terms of the forest structure.
I think, and I'm remembering, and this is going to kind of lead into my question with you, Catherine, is that you might remember in 2014 and 2015, the ocean wasn't the only area experiencing massive heat waves. We had similar situations, and we had massive heat waves coupled with the fact that we've been in severe droughts. And then this exacerbated pine bark beetle infestation. So you already had trees that were stressed. They were drought stressed. And then you had a species that even though it's native, like we just learned, these pests, their reproductive capacity and their range expands first. And so these trees, which normally can combat this species of beetle, were not able to. They were too stressed. And I think it was some 200 million trees that died. And so I think it's really important and a great point to bring up that while carbon sequestration can be measured tree by tree, I think, correct?
Sure.
I did it in Watsonville. Maybe I might not have known what I was doing, but it sounded good because I got funding to do it. And that's why, but it is going back into that ecological diversity. So it is all of it. And then that feeds into my question for you, Catherine. So the kelp forest, I don't know how many of you are aware of how incredibly biodiverse kelp forests are, and also their ability to be massive carbon sequesters. The kelp is kind of the biological equivalent of diversity in the water. So can you elaborate a little bit more, Catherine, on one, the positive effect kelp has in reversing the effects of greenhouse gases, and how important it is that we bring back these trophic predators to help combat the stresses that are affecting the kelp, like heat?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Let me know if I am speaking too loudly. Yeah, so great question.
Thank you.
I'm going to build on a lot of what Paige said because I am much less versed in the carbon sequestration portion of the research. But just to make a quick point, talking about reversing climate change, we can't really do that, unfortunately. I think a lot about, I don't want to call them scheme because that makes them sound bad, but there's a lot of movements out there to offset things that you do. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about it because I think it's something that comes from a good place, and it comes from a place of people wanting to help and acknowledging that they're doing something that's not great for the planet, like flying on an airplane and like, oh, if I can offset my carbon footprint from this, and they'll plant X mangroves somewhere, which I think in practice is a great idea. The problem is, and this was something Paige touched on, is like the amount of time it takes to happen. And you can't assume that just because you've planted something, it's going to be successful to sequester carbon. So I think I like to think of the work that kelp forests do as more of a way to help kind of staunch the flow of death instead of completely reversing it. So I think that's what I'll end with carbon sequestration. But similar to forests, you can think of kelp forests, and we have other amazing things like seagrass beds and eelgrass beds, which we have a ton of here in Santa Cruz. You can see really beautiful ones on low king tides near natural bridges, and they also function similarly to forests. They can sequester carbon and hold that within their leafy structures, and seagrass beds also have a root structure that helps hold the carbon in too. So I guess I'll talk more about the second part of your question, of which was the importance of restoring. Yes,
Yeah.
predators.
Predators.
Yeah, so a lot of our systems are very delicate. I think we think of them as feeling really robust, like you go out to a beautiful mountain and you see all these huge trees and these huge things that have stood the test of time, and you think that it looks really tough. But they're actually all so sensitive, and you can just do one tiny thing that has these like rippling effects. And I think there's a lot of really known instances of this delicacy of habitats and ecosystems when we think about instances when people have done something and then tried to correct it and it's gone wrong. So I think there's like the famous instance in Australia where they had like introduced a toad to control a pest, and then the toads got out of hand, so they brought a snake in, and the snakes actually didn't eat them. And it's like the unintended consequences of trying to do something good. And so in California, we love our kelp forests, and they're super important economically. They support large commercial and recreational fisheries. They sequester carbon, which is really important. They have all these great ecosystem services. We depend on them from tourism. I'm happy just knowing they exist. So there's all these great things that they do, but they're super sensitive. Like I said before, they have these narrow ranges that they like to be happy in. And once you mess that up, it's really hard to fix it. And it's also really expensive to fix it. And unfortunately, I would say the area of science that people like to fund the least is monitoring on projects. It's not exciting. You're like, imagine you're reading a proposal and they're like, you want me to pay you how many millions of dollars to go take pictures of something? And like, okay, yeah, it's not exciting. You're not going out there and doing the work, but science happens on such a slow time scale. And then our decisions need to happen on a fast time scale. So I think that's one of the harder parts probably of working in an area of science that is also relevant to policy, is these two things operate on very different timescales. And so ways to fix our kelp forest systems are really hard. And I think you just kind of have to go at it from all angles. Like, I think kelp forest restoration is important. So outplanting little baby kelp plants is important. One of the issues that California has is, which I try to look at it as a good thing, is California has, we have our National Environmental Protection Act, and we have a state one, and California is one of, I think, like 5 states that has a stricter state act than a national act, which is cool. We like to protect our stuff, but it also means when we need to intervene, it's really hard to do it. And so something that would help a lot is reintroducing predators. But the powers that be don't want to do that because there's lots of unintended consequences. What if we make it worse? So the fixing of it is hard, and people are doing it, but again, it takes time that we probably don't have, and that people take as a lack of proof that it works. I don't have an inspiring note to end on, but
But this does touch into both the book and having different worldviews, and also back into what Paige had said with the spotted owl and the loggers. It's the same. This is not dissimilar things, right? In the case with kelp, one of the major hurdles. So there's been discussion about trying to reintroduce southern sea otters, and actually northern sea otters, because southern sea otters are endangered. So you cannot move an endangered species, but sea otters used to range all through California, Oregon, and Washington, and there has been discussion in trying to potentially reintroduce the northern sea otter into some of these habitats, while there are still efforts being done to recover the sunflower star, which has been decimated by sea star wasting. Those are your 2 apex predators. But understandably, there's a lot of fisher people that are very concerned, especially now, depending on their fishery, with the impact of otters. I don't know how many of you saw Lookout magazine today, talking about the collapse of the Dungeness crab fishery. So this is also tying into forest protection. You have the lumber industry and people who have been working in these jobs for generations, and they are struggling also with the impacts of climate. But then you also have that need for ecological diversity and biodiversity. So if you have monoculture, if you have one particular species of tree everywhere, you are going to bring in a greater chance for disease and a greater chance of collapse and less biodiversity. So these are nuanced. And I want to just ask 2 more things, and I want to open it up to the audience. So I'm going to merge again. I want to talk about shifting baselines. Has anybody heard that term before, shifting baselines? Anybody want to give it a shot? What they picture? What do you picture when you picture that term, shifting baselines? Yeah, so we're seeing that. And this goes back into the health of forest and recovery. What are we recovering to? And so I want to ask Paige first. Seeing that trees and their distribution ranges are changing. Some are contracting, some are expanding. What kind of shifting baselines, and please let me know if you don't know, have you seen in California with trees and tree species over time? Any of them?
Denise, when she introduced me, mentioned my work in fire management fire management. And if we look at a forest that's been left in place and left alone, one might consider that its normal condition. But we know that when Smokey the Bear has been the rule of law, the forests are not experiencing the fires that they used to, both because we're putting out fires and we're not actively starting fires that indigenous cultures have done in this state for millennia. And that means that the forests that we look out our window and see aren't any type of normal, or that normal doesn't mean anything. When I think about shifting baselines, I think about the good citizens in Texas who were out planting pine trees after a fire in an ecosystem that had until 50 years before been a grass prairie, because they love their trees and they felt a kinship to them. They felt that was their place, that was their home. Here in California, we have forests that have experienced up to 150 years of fire suppression and are now sort of reaping the consequences of that. And a thickening and a homogenization of the forest structure is something that that you could name. If you look at a picture of Yosemite from 1899 and you compare it to a picture in the 70s, there's this patchy, scraggly, almost kind of funny looking character to the forest at the turn of the century that by the 70s was a smooth, even carpet of trees that looks very pleasing to the eye because it's very regular, but it's also very flammable. That's one of our patterns that has shifted in a way within our lifetimes that isn't the only way it could be, isn't the only way it's been, and isn't necessarily the healthiest when we think about ecosystem services.
Active stewardship. And I have a similar question for you, Catherine, involving shifting baselines with salmon. So how many of you have heard about the Klamath Dam removal project? It's one of the first of its kind. It's one of the biggest. So my question to you is kind of double-sided here. One, what impact, because I'm hoping to continue to see a trend of dam removal, especially dams that have been out of service. We have hundreds of them in California that are not in operation. So one, should there be more of an effort to be looking at dam removal in areas further north or more conducive to these shifting baselines? If we were to mitigate strategy or management policies, how much, I guess what I'm saying is, how much should we consider salmon populations? One, if they are shifting, if we're seeing these shifting baselines, and two, where they're going to. And then I'll leave the rest of us to decide where the dams are, if we should put our energy there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna preface this by saying I know almost nothing about dams, so
That's okay.
probably not the best person to ask.
Better than me.
Yeah. I know from my research that dams have been one of the leading contributors to declines in salmon populations. As the name suggests, they dam up the water. So they take water that would normally flow through stream beds and save it up in one spot. So you're doing a lot of different things. You're altering the structure of the stream beds. Salmon are very particular and they depend on like specific stream morphology and the gravel to lay their eggs. So when I talked before about ecosystems being sensitive, it's kind of this like perfect combination of factors that needs to be present to have success. When we have dams in place, it also gives rise for non-native and invasive species to really take hold and flourish. So in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, we see a lot of introduced species there that are really flourishing in areas of that have been affected by the dams. So you go from systems that used to be kind of medium to fast flowing streams that aren't crazy deep and more wide, cooler water temperatures to these human changed areas of more stagnant, deep, warm waters that really make things thrive, that also like to snack on salmon. So that's my thought partially about dams. As to whether we should look further north for dam removal, I think that's hard because while I have seen in my research that salmon seem to be moving for the most part northward in their oceanic distribution based off of where they're caught, they still try to go back to the same place. So then you have to start thinking about stuff like, well, could you just move them? So like assisted relocation. Salmon are tricky They've tried to remediate some of the impacts of dams by having hatcheries, which is a whole other complex topic. There's good things and bad things about hatcheries. I think they're trying to decommission some hatcheries.
Yeah. Have you seen, so there are shifts in their population distribution, but salmon are also trying to go back to where they were.
Yes,
Got it. All right. I know that they're like, what, 1,000,000-year-old species, correct?
probably very old.
We can learn a lot
There
from
for a long
salmon.
time.
We can learn a lot from salmon. All right, this is my last question for both of you. And then I want to open it up to all of you. So, and this is so it's going to be like kind of a two-part question. And I'm going to start with you, Paige. One, how can we better engage and educate the next generation to become the scientists and stewards needed to address the climate-driven displacement of terrestrial life on the Central Coast and educate them about the interconnectedness of climate change, habitat destruction, species migration? If you could just solve that for us, that would be awesome.
I'm thrilled to say I'm working on that. I mentioned I'm doing a postdoc. Thank you. I'm doing a postdoc in education research. I work with Erica Zavaleta and Roxanne Beltran at UC Santa Cruz, and they have a wealth of programs dedicated to getting students involved in science, reaching out to people who aren't yet students, taking non-traditional paths, and seeing themselves as scientists. And the way that I'm helping with that work is to study how field trips light a fire in people, how students also, like in the book, the kindergarten class that comes out to see the butterflies, that could be a moment that changes the path. A young Preston Turnbow might discover his love for science in that setting. And that goes for every age and every stage. So when we take college students to the field, we find that the social connections between students and the conceptual connections between the people and their environment are much stronger than we can necessarily achieve in a traditional classroom setting. So we want to take advantage of that and support those kind of experiences and those transformative learning opportunities for any and all students.
You're here. My thesis was on this. I totally back everything. And I'm gonna couple that in a moment. And I want to ask you the same question, Catherine, about what do you think we would need for better or deeper engagements, either to motivate people to go into the sciences or to understand how to steward, in this case, our oceans? What are your thoughts?
I don't do any of the cool work that Paige does working with people at all. I sit at my computer and I do my little codes and think about fish. So I might have more of like a pessimistic view about things. I do think that it all starts with kids, for many reasons. The first of which, kids are great about shaming people and they feel no qualms with doing it. Like, I think, you see a kid that sees somebody smoking and they're immediately very vocal about being like, you shouldn't do that. That's disgusting. And I think it's simple, but I think that carries a lot of weight. And so I think educating kids early on, not just about what the issues are, but I think it's really important to establish connection to the system. Paige talked about this, about the example from the book with the Christmas tree farm and trees. And obviously not everybody is lucky enough to live on the coast or spend time on the coast or have ever been there, but everybody has some type of connection to the coast and coastal systems. And I think figuring out how to show that to different people is a big part of it. I think making sure that groups that traditionally haven't had access to outdoor spaces have that access, in turn with showing people that there's a scientist can look like different kinds of people and that a scientist doesn't have to be a full-time job. Like, you can be a person that has a different day job and be a scientist like on the weekends. There's lots of great community and citizen science ways to get involved. And I think sometimes people, I myself included, you feel like if you can't do the biggest, best everything, like why would you do it at all? And I think knowing that there's lots of little intermediate steps to become involved is a good thing to think about.
Love that. Yeah. And I will say that I worked at the Sea Odyssey, Colonial Sea Odyssey program with students for 16 years. And one of the reasons I did that was because I felt like I could reach my greatest audience. If I hit even 7 kids out of a group of 30, I knew that those 7 kids were gonna go home and they were gonna nag their parents and shame their parents and shame their aunts and their uncles and their brothers and their sisters. And then years later, I did my master's thesis to see if I was right. And it's true. And so I just want to end that, and I want to kind of bring everything that you both just said in particular about this. Outdoor experiences in nature matter. They matter. They matter at all ages. We have so many opportunities for community science or working with restoration in Santa Cruz. I don't know how many of you are aware of a site called Environteers. I can not write that on the whiteboard because I'm not in the classroom. I can tell you it after we're done and I can show you the site, but it's posted regularly with updates about beach cleanup, community events, restoration events, cleaning up San Lorenzo River, Friends of Sea Cliff State Park, putting in native plants. And it's a way to get involved and get your hands in, and it brings you to that connection. And there's no age it's too late to do that. And also it's medicine, it's the antidote. It's the antidote to so many of the things that are out of our control. A lot of these things that we're talking about, climate change, CO2 emissions, watching populations, extinction events, seeing things change, the amount of time it's going to take, the monitoring. The monitoring could be done a lot more easily if we were all a part of it. And so that's something to be thinking about when we're looking at cuts and funding to take some of the weight off of the scientists' shoulders so they can do what they need to do and then allow these other action steps, monitoring, restoration, that can come from us. It does not take it and somebody who's an expert in their field. And please bring your children or your grandchildren or your nieces or your nephews, or maybe you have a neighbor who has a kid that they just look like they're just good. Bring them along and get that energy out. But these are all things to be thinking about. And I want to just open it up now to questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And, you know, in this time of kind of grieving and hand-wringing, the question that I get asked more than anything else is, what should we be doing? Yeah. So you've given us a couple of great suggestions in volunteers and right to our electeds. So great. But if you have other thoughts, I would love to hear it, because that's a question that I get asked every day. What should we be doing?
Great question. Which one of you?
Just put it right in the middle.
Great question.
I think I would have given a different answer 6 months ago. I don't know if my job will be funded in the next year. I don't know. So I'm speaking to you as someone who's not exactly sure what I'm doing. I'm trying to stay afloat. I'm trying to find ways that I can use my skills that I've worked hard on and contribute to the work that needs to be done. And I used to know a lot of ways to do that are looking rather imperiled. But I think coming together, coming to events like this one and seeking opportunities to learn and share what we've learned. You work with people, you're working with people right now. I think those connections between people matter. They're how we'll exchange information. They are how we'll learn about those kind of efforts to get involved, whether it's science or civil rights or your favorite cause that's being attacked right now. And so I would say, know your neighbors, reach out, be in community. That never fails.
I have a question.
I don't have anything to add to Paige's excellent answer, but I think community, yes, because not one person can research every single issue. And I think trying to do it on your own leads to a lot of like hopelessness and frustration when you do nothing. So I think convincing scientists to be outside of our offices is great, because I think by nature we're kind of like solitary, and I just want to sit at my computer and get my stuff done and pray that my next year of PhD funding isn't ripped away from me. So I think opportunities like this to interface with people and tell 20 people about something and then they tell 20 more people, and to try to make things approachable, because there is a lot of complexity to science, but there's also a lot that is just kind of like easy to figure out and should be exciting. So
Our question from Zoom is, would marine protected areas along the Monterey coastline help protect kelp forests and fish population?
that is a fantastic question. I was hoping somebody would ask. So for those of you who don't know about them, marine protected areas, you can kind of think of them as like a state or national park in the water. There's lots of different kinds, and they kind of range in regards to what activities you can do inside of them. Some are kind of like don't look, don't touch, look from a distance. Others you can fish seasonally or for certain types of species in them. And they were historically created as a way to help supplement actually populations of fish for sport fishing and commercial fishing. Unfortunately, they were created poorly in California, where the state powers that be basically went to fishermen and said, hey, where do you fish? Fishermen told them, and then the MPAs were there. So there's been work to fix that. There's still some hurt feelings, and it's a complex process. So we do have marine protected areas around Monterey and around Santa Cruz, and then we have the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which is not a marine protected area, but it's like a different flavor, same but different. And so areas, management zones like that are really great for thinking about how we can protect species from what I like to call extractive activities. So taking something out of the system, fishing, going through it with a boat and like ripping out kelp, disturbing the system. But in terms of activities or things like climate change that we have very little physical control over, there's kind of like mixed responses. There's recent work coming out now looking at if marine protected areas can kind of serve as like refugia for climate change. And unfortunately, most of the data says no. Which is sad because lots of money goes into MPAs and they have a really good potential to work well. This is, again, I'm going to go back to my slide and preface this by saying this is my personal opinion as somebody that's worked in this and does not represent anybody that gives me money. But MPA, unlike state parks, MPAs, I think should be managed differently. Right now, MPAs are static. You have an MPA that's been there for X number of years, and that's always where it's supposed to be. But we have this thing called adaptive management, which is how they're supposed to be managed, which means we put an MPA here and then let's wait 10 years and do an assessment and see how it's doing and change the area, change how it's managed. And we kind of do that and we get feedback, but then we don't change anything. And that's for a variety of reasons, which I can talk to people about later. But I do think there is a hidden potential for MPAs to help more, but it's not going to happen if we keep them in the same place.
And this goes again to the shifting baselines. An area that might have made sense during a certain period to be a completely hands-off marine protected area might not make sense in 10 years. Yeah. Thank you. That was excellent. Other questions?
Yeah, Catherine. So how are the fisheries measured? I mean, to see whether the fishery is crashed or is has ample fish or something. Who and what and how is that done?
It's
a doozy.
That is a doozy. That's a good question though. And I probably can't answer it well because it's a branch of, we'll call it like marine ecology, fisheries ecology, and statistics called like stock assessments. And they're really confusing. I don't know them that well because I don't know a lot about them. And different fisheries and different species have different ways of assessing the stock. So for salmon, what they look at is escapement. So how many fish are coming back and escaping fishing pressure from the ocean. So they use that number and how it changes every year as one of the inputs into these models, which theoretically gives you an idea of how many salmon we think are out there. So it's looking at escapement, so how many individuals are coming back to reproduce, different ideas of like size, because that's related to the fecundity of the fish. So how many eggs, how many offspring are being produced. But they're really complicated. It sounds like it should be easy, but it's not, and they take a really long time. And so in an ideal world, you would have a stock assessment done like multiple times a year, because conditions change so frequently, and you want to have the best information to provide to people who want to go out and fish and make decisions, but they take like years to do. Sometimes 5 to 10 years. So information makes its way out slowly, and some of that is just kind of like the nature of science. We've talked about it before, but it takes a lot of time and money to collect data. So there's a lot of fisheries that do stock assessments based off of like catch, but also observers who are sometimes funded by environmental agencies, and sometimes the boats that they're on to count numbers of fish and the sizes to get an idea of what we think might be left in the ocean. But it's not an easy process, and it's also not a perfect science. So we've been doing it for a lot of species for decades, and for some species it might work well, but how do we change the way we're doing it to account for climate change and things that we might not know about?
I've had many of my students, one of their first jobs, either while they're in college or right after, is to be an observer or a biological monitor, which is similar to an observer, only you are on land during periods when they're doing construction and you're checking to see what species are there endangered species. All of this takes a lot of people on the ground, and these are not high-paying jobs. If you're if you're an observer on a boat and you're observing catch, if you're doing fish counts, I mean, just to give you an idea of how low paying this is to get people interested in the field. But my most recent student did it in the outskirts of Idaho along the Eel River, where she was camping, and it was $11 an hour. So science comes slowly, and it comes to tediousness, and it kind of goes back full circle to resiliency. And that's kind of what we're talking about, is the resiliency and being in this field, so we can study the resiliency of the other creatures that we live on this planet with. And that's going to take resilience on all of our parts. Other question, and yeah, two more, we have time for two more questions. Yes.
Well, you mentioned students in education. You talked about the Sea Odyssey. There's Watsonville Wetlands Watch.
Yeah, I work with them
There's
too.
Life Lab. There must be others. And it's going to be more and more important that we get involved and do something. Do you know of other ones, other opportunities?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yes, so Measure Q, we're going to see more opportunities for that. We funded Measure Q in Santa Cruz and Santa Cruz County. We have money hopefully coming in from the IRA. So I will say that, yes, there is Life Lab, Watsonville Wetlands Watch, Regeneración, Land Trust Santa Cruz does amazing work. State Parks needs volunteers desperately. State Parks is doing a lot of work. They have restoration events. They have docents being any kind of job, doing a docent at Natural Bridges, at Henry Cowell. There's not enough people that are getting involved now in interpretation. Monterey Bay Sanctuary Exploration Center has education programs for children, also has docent programs. I know I'm leaving a bunch out because I'm in the moment. Amaboots and Tribal Band, there's a lot. But Environteers, again, is the site I would go to, because there's organizations you wouldn't even know.
I wanted to add one more answer. My partner and I have taken our small amount of money that we give to charity every year, and we're giving it to the Boys and Girls Club for field trips. And we said, and we want field trips in nature, and, we'll pay for 2 extra field trips a year. So we knew that they were doing that. So I mean, there's a way, like, regular people can just pull their money together and give kids those experiences.
Thank you so much. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for being here and staying here and being engaged and asking all the right questions. There are no dumb yes, there are. But none of them were asked here. Paige and Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For everything. For your inspiration. Thank you, Friends Library, for all of the Community Reads program. I think that's the only way to get involved. Keep coming to these events and find other people in your community who are caring and doing this work. It spreads. Anger and apathy spread, but so does joy and awe and passion. So thank you, everybody.
You both made it so.
Thank you for coming.
I see, yeah.